The Atlantic wind carried salt and uncertainty through the streets of Praia da Luz on the night of the 3rd of May, 2007. It was the kind of breeze that locals knew well, constant and searching, finding its way through every crack and crevice of the small Portuguese resort town. On that particular evening, it found an unlocked patio door at apartment 5A of the Ocean Club Resort, pushing it gently back and forth on its hinges, a rhythmic creaking that would later haunt everyone who heard about it. Inside, the silence was absolute, the kind of silence that feels wrong, that presses against your eardrums with its weight. At exactly 10 p.m., Kate McCann pushed open the door to her children's bedroom, expecting to see the peaceful forms of her 3 sleeping children. Instead, she found 2. The twins remained undisturbed in their travel cots, but Madeleine's bed stood empty, the covers disturbed, the stuffed toy left behind. The scream that followed ripped through the quiet night like a wound opening in the fabric of the world itself. Witnesses several apartments away reported hearing it, that primal sound of a mother discovering the unthinkable. Within minutes, the small resort community erupted into chaos. Flashlights cutting through the darkness, voices calling a little girl's name into the indifferent wind. What happened in apartment 5A that night has become one of the most analyzed, debated, and disputed mysteries of the 21st century. But here is what makes this case particularly haunting. After 17 years of investigation, after countless theories and false leads, after the initial evidence was collected and conclusions were drawn, new information has begun to surface. Information that calls into question nearly everything we thought we understood about those crucial hours. Witnesses who remained silent for over a decade have recently come forward with accounts that contradict the established timeline. Forensic techniques that did not exist in 2007 have been applied to preserved evidence, yielding results that paint a darker, more complex picture than anyone imagined. Digital footprints, invisible at the time, have now been reconstructed, revealing patterns of behavior that disturb even seasoned investigators. The central question remains suspended in that Atlantic breeze, unanswered and chilling. Was this an opportunistic abduction by someone who noticed the unlocked door and the vulnerable child within? Was it a carefully planned kidnapping, orchestrated by someone who had been watching, waiting, studying the family's routines? Or was it something else entirely, something that unfolded in those hours that is far more disturbing than either of those possibilities? The truth, as it often does, may lie somewhere in the shadows between what we know and what we fear. The evening of May 3rd, 2007 began like so many others at the Ocean Club Resort in Praia da Luz. British tourists settled into their holiday routines, children were bathed and put to bed, and adults prepared for their evening meals. But this was the night when every glance at a clock, every movement through the dimly lit pathways, every remembered detail would be picked apart for years to come. This was the night when time itself became a weapon, a puzzle, a labyrinth of contradictions that would haunt everyone involved. The group that would become known as the Tapas 7 gathered at the Tapas restaurant around 8:30 that evening. David and Fiona Payne, Russell O'Brien and Jane Tanner, Matthew and Rachel Oldfield, and of course, Kate and Gary McCann. They had arranged this dinner the same way they had every night of their holiday, requesting a table with a view toward their apartment block. The restaurant was approximately 50 to 70 meters from apartment 5A, where 3-year-old Madeleine McCann slept alongside her twin siblings, Sean and Amelie. The checking system they had agreed upon seemed reasonable at the time. Every 30 minutes, one of the parents would excuse themselves from dinner, walk back to their respective apartments, listen at the doors or peer through windows, and return to report that all was well. This rotation of responsibility would later become one of the most scrutinized aspects of the entire investigation. Who checked when? Who actually entered which apartment? Who merely listened at a door? The answers to these questions would shift and change with nearly every retelling. According to the initial statements, Gary McCann performed the first check around 9:05 in the evening. He later reported that he entered the apartment through the unlocked patio door, walked to the children's bedroom, and observed all 3 children sleeping peacefully. Madeleine was lying in her bed, her favorite stuffed animal beside her. The twins were in their travel cots. Everything appeared perfectly normal. He returned to the restaurant and informed the group that all was well. But here's where the timeline begins to fracture. At approximately 9:10 to 9:15, Matthew Oldfield also claims to have checked on the McCann children. Some statements suggest he merely listened at the door. Other accounts indicate he actually entered the apartment, but did not look fully into the children's bedroom, because the door was more closed than it had been when Jerry checked. He could see the twins in their cots but could not see Madeleine's bed from his vantage point. He heard no sounds of distress. He assumed everything was fine. During this same window of time between 9:10 and 9:15, something extraordinary happened. Jane Tanner, walking back from checking on her own daughter, witnessed a man carrying a child in the street near apartment 5AA. She would later describe this man as having dark hair, approximately 35 years old, wearing tan or beige trousers, and a dark jacket. The child appeared to be wearing light-colored pajamas, possibly pink. The man was walking purposefully away from the Ocean Club complex toward the outer edge of the town. This sighting would become one of the most controversial pieces of evidence in the entire case. Jane Tanner was certain of what she saw. She was equally certain of the time. But here is the problem. At the exact moment, she claims to have been walking up that path and witnessing this man with a child. Gary McCann was standing at the top of the street, talking with another British tourist named Jeremy Wilkins. Gary and Jeremy both confirmed this conversation took place. Neither man saw Jane Tanner walk past. Jane Tanner did not see or acknowledge either of them. How does a woman walk within meters of two men standing in conversation without any of them noticing each other? How does such a significant sighting occur with no corroborating witnesses? The geometry of the scene has been analyzed repeatedly. The lighting conditions have been reconstructed. Various explanations have been offered, from selective attention to simple human error. But the fundamental question remains unanswered. The dinner continued. The group talked and laughed and drank wine. At some point around 9:30, Kate McCann rose from the table to perform her check. She walked the familiar path back to apartment 5A. She entered through the unlocked patio doors. The living room was as they had left it. She walked toward the children's bedroom. And then her world ended. The bedroom door, which had been only partially open, was now fully open. She noticed immediately that Madeleine's bed was empty. The covers were disturbed. She checked the bathroom, thinking perhaps the child had gotten up to use the toilet. Nothing. She looked behind furniture, in closets, any place a small child might hide. The window behind Madeleine's bed was open, the shutters raised from the outside. Kate McCann ran from the apartment screaming words that would echo through the years. They have taken her. Someone has taken her. The timeline from this point forward becomes a blur of panic and confusion. Gary McCann and the other men immediately began searching the apartment complex, the surrounding streets, the beach. The women stayed with the other children. The resort staff were alerted. The Portuguese police were called, and then began the agonizing process of trying to piece together who had been where and when during those crucial hours. But there was another sighting that would not emerge until several days later. An Irish family named Smith had been walking home from a local restaurant at approximately 10 o'clock that evening. Martin Smith, his wife, and his adult children encountered a man carrying a child near the bottom of the hill that led away from the Ocean Club. This man was walking urgently toward the beach area. The child appeared to be sleeping or unconscious, wearing light-colored pajamas. Martin Smith would later say there was something unsettling about the encounter, something that did not feel right even in the moment. The description of this second man differed significantly from Jane Tanner's account. The Smith sighting described a man who was not quite as tall, not quite as dark. The clothing was different. The direction was different. The time was 45 minutes later. If both sightings were genuine, they could not both be of the same man carrying the same child. Yet both witnesses were adamant about what they had seen. The investigation began immediately, but it began on foundations of sand. The initial police response has been widely criticized as inadequate. The apartment was not sealed as a crime scene for several hours. Dozens of people walked through it, potentially contaminating evidence. The surrounding areas were not secure. The critical first hours were lost to confusion and competing jurisdictions. As the days passed and statements were taken and retaken, the inconsistencies multiplied like cracks in glass. The checking timeline that had seemed so clear initially began to show gaps and contradictions. One parent would recall checking at 9:15, Another would remember that same check happening at 9:30. Someone remembered a door being closed that another person distinctly recalled being open. Details that should have been seared into memory proved frustratingly fluid. Recently emerged evidence has only deepened these mysteries. CCTV footage from establishments near the Ocean Club, footage that was not initially reviewed or was somehow overlooked, has surfaced in recent years. This footage shows movements around the complex during the crucial window of 8:30 to 10:30 that evening. Figures appear and disappear from camera range. Vehicles pass that were never accounted for in witness statements. The grainy, time-stamped images raise more questions than they answer. Who were these people? Why were their movements never explained? Even more troubling is the cell phone data that has been analyzed using technology not available in the immediate aftermath of Madeleine's disappearance. Cell tower pings and location data have revealed that certain individuals were in locations they initially denied visiting that evening. These are not members of the Tapas 7 necessarily, but people connected to the resort, people who were working that night, people who gave statements that the cell data now contradicts. The question that haunts every examination of this evidence is simple. Why would anyone lie about their whereabouts during a missing child investigation unless they had something to hide? What could be so damaging that maintaining a false timeline was worth the risk of obstruction charges? The checking system itself has been questioned endlessly. Why not use a baby monitor? Why leave the doors unlocked? Why not pay for resort childcare? These questions, asked and answered 1,000 times, miss the essential point. Millions of parents make similar decisions every day. They step outside for a moment. They assume their children are safe behind locked doors. They balance their desire for adult time against the statistical improbability of disaster. The McCann's decisions that night were not unusual until they became the framework for tragedy. But the inconsistencies in the witness statements, the contradictions in the timeline, the unexplained movements captured on surveillance, and the cell phone data that reveals hidden truths, all of these create an atmosphere of deception that is impossible to ignore. Someone knows more than they have said. Multiple people, perhaps, are holding pieces of information they have deemed too dangerous or too personally damaging to reveal. The human memory is not a video recorder. It is a reconstruction, influenced by stress, suggestion, and self-interest. Every time we recall an event, we slightly alter it. Under the extraordinary pressure of a missing child investigation with worldwide media attention, these normal memory distortions become magnified. But the question remains whether what we are seeing in this case is normal memory failure or active concealment. The evening of May 3rd has been reconstructed by investigators, journalists, and amateur sleuths thousands of times. Computer models have been built. Timelines have been charted minute by minute. Actors have retraced steps. And yet, certainty remains elusive. The gaps in the narrative refuse to close. The contradictions multiply rather than resolve. Somewhere in those hours between dinner beginning and Kate McCann's scream of anguish lies the answer to what happened to Madeleine McCann. But that answer remains hidden behind a wall of inconsistencies, conflicting accounts, and the terrible unreliability of human perception under unbearable stress. The scene inside apartment 5 at the Ocean Club Resort in Praia da Luz should have been meticulously preserved, photographed from every angle, treated with the reverence that any potential crime scene demands. Instead, what unfolded in those first crucial hours would become one of the most contentious aspects of the entire investigation, a cascade of decisions that would haunt the case for decades to come. When Portuguese police arrived at the vacation apartment on the night of May 3rd, 2007, they entered a space already compromised by foot traffic, by desperate searches, by well-meaning friends and resort staff who had trampled through rooms looking for a missing child. The Polícia Judiciária, Portugal's criminal investigation unit, would later face withering criticism for their handling of what may have been the most important crime scene in modern European history. Evidence collection was delayed. The apartment was not immediately sealed. And perhaps most damaging of all, the forensic examination that should have begun within hours did not commence in earnest for nearly a full day after Madeleine McCann was reported missing. The layout of apartment 5A itself tells a story that investigators would spend years trying to properly decode. The ground floor holiday rental opened directly onto a small garden area and the pool beyond. Inside, a combined living and dining area connected to a compact kitchen. Down a narrow hallway, 2 bedrooms and a bathroom completed the modest space. The master bedroom, where Kate and Jerry McCann slept, faced the street. The children's bedroom, where 3-year-old Madeleine and her 2-year-old twin siblings were sleeping that night, sat at the back corner of the apartment, its window facing a quiet side street and a small car park. That window would become the focal point of intense scrutiny and endless debate. Initial reports suggested an intruder had forced entry through it, crowbarring the shutters from outside. But forensic examination found no tool marks on the shutter or window frame. No disturbed soil beneath the window where someone would have stood. No fingerprints on the sill where an abductor would have climbed through while carrying a sleeping child. The window could only be opened from inside the apartment, leading investigators to consider a disturbing possibility. If the window was opened, someone inside the apartment must have done it. Yet, there was another way in. The patio doors at the rear of the apartment could be opened from outside if left unlocked, which the McCanns confirmed they had been. This entrance became the more plausible route for any intruder theory. The doors opened silently, required no force, and led directly into the living area with easy access to the hallway and bedrooms beyond. When forensic teams finally conducted their initial examination, they found remarkably little physical evidence. No signs of struggle in the children's bedroom. The twin siblings slept undisturbed through whatever had occurred. Madeleine's bed showed impressions suggesting she had been lying there, but no blood, no torn fabric, no indication of violence. The apartment, by most measures, appeared unremarkable. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, and what investigators could not see with their eyes would require different tools to reveal. Weeks passed. The investigation expanded, contracted, spun in circles as leads evaporated and theories multiplied. Then, in late July of 2007, the Portuguese police made a decision that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of the case. They called in specialist resources from the United Kingdom. 2 English Springer Spaniels, trained in the most specialized and controversial field of forensic detection. Eddie and Keela, cadaver dogs whose abilities would spark fierce debate in forensic science circles and courtrooms around the world. Eddie was trained to detect human cadaverine, the scent of human decomposition. Not blood, not living human scent. Only the specific chemical signature that emerges when human tissue begins to break down after death. Keela was trained to detect minute traces of human blood, even amounts invisible to the naked eye, even after cleaning attempts. Together, the dogs represented the cutting edge of forensic detection technology, living instruments more sensitive than any machine yet developed. When the dogs entered apartment 5A on the 1st of August, 2007, nearly 3 months after Madeleine disappeared, they began a systematic search of every room, every surface, every corner. Eddie, the cadaver dog, showed no interest in most of the apartment. He moved through the kitchen without reaction, passed through the children's bedroom calmly. Then he entered the living area, and his behavior changed dramatically. Behind the sofa pushed against one wall, Eddie began to bark intensely, a trained alert response indicating detection. The handler marked the spot. The dog was moved away and brought back for confirmation. Again, the same alert in the same location. The area behind the sofa, an easily overlooked space in a vacation rental, had triggered a response indicating the possible presence of human decomposition. Keela, the blood detection dog, also alerted in the living room, though in slightly different locations. The implications sent shockwaves through the investigation. If these alerts were accurate, they suggested something impossible to reconcile with an abduction scenario. They suggested that a body, or part of a body, had been present in that apartment. That human blood had been spilled in that space. But the dogs had more to reveal. Weeks later, when presented with a silver Renault Scenic that the McCanns had rented 25 days after Madeleine disappeared, both dogs alerted again. Eddie indicated the scent of human decomposition in the vehicle's trunk. Keela detected possible blood residue in the same area. The timeline made these alerts particularly troubling. The car had not existed in the family's possession when Madeleine vanished. Yet the dog suggested it had transported something connected to human death. Portuguese investigators seized on these findings. Samples were collected from the areas where the dogs had alerted. The materials were sent to the Forensic Science Service Laboratory in Birmingham, England, for DNA analysis. And here the case entered the murky territory where science meets interpretation, where laboratory results become ammunition for competing narratives. The forensic scientist tasked with analyzing the samples, a respected expert in DNA profiling, found biological material but faced significant challenges. The samples were degraded, contaminated by the passage of time and the environment. The DNA profiles extracted were partial, incomplete, what forensic scientists call low copy number DNA. This type of analysis examines tiny quantities of genetic material, so small that contamination risks increase exponentially and interpretation becomes highly subjective. The scientist's report was careful, hedged with appropriate scientific caution. The DNA from the sample collected behind the sofa showed 15 markers. Some of these markers matched Madeleine's known DNA profile. But crucially, the match was incomplete. Other markers were present that could not be attributed to her. The scientists concluded that the DNA could have come from Madeleine, but it could also have come from any number of other individuals. The profile was too complex, too degraded to make a definitive determination. From the car, similar results emerged. Possible matches, possible exclusions, nothing certain. For those convinced of the parents' innocence, these results were exculpatory. The DNA did not definitively match Madeleine. The samples could easily be explained by the family's legitimate occupancy of the apartment and car, by innocent transfer of biological material through normal contact. For those harboring suspicions, the results were troubling enough to warrant continued investigation. The presence of DNA markers, consistent with the missing child in locations flagged by cadaver dogs, created a circumstantial pattern difficult to ignore. The reliability of cadaver dogs themselves became a battlefield of expert opinion. Proponents pointed to impressive track records, cases where the dogs' alerts led to discoveries of remains that confirmed their accuracy. The dogs were not trained to alert to anything but human decomposition. They did not respond to animal remains, to cleaning products, to food. Their specificity was their strength. But critics raised valid concerns. The dogs could not indicate how much decomposition material was present, whether it was a large amount or a microscopic trace. They could not determine how long the scent had been present. And crucially, false positives were possible, particularly in complex environments where cross-contamination might occur. Then came the luminol testing, conducted months into the investigation when the apartment stood empty, released from its role as an active crime scene. Luminol, a chemical compound that fluoresces when it contacts blood, even blood that has been cleaned or degraded, was applied to the floors of apartment 5A in the living room. Behind that same sofa where Eddie had alerted, the luminol revealed a pattern. A glow appeared under ultraviolet light, suggesting the presence of blood residue. The shape was irregular, cleaned but not eliminated. Something had been there. Something biological. Something someone had attempted to remove. But luminol is not specific to blood alone. It reacts to other substances. Bleach. Certain cleaning agents. Rust. I. Plant materials. Without confirmatory testing, a luminol reaction proves only that something worth investigating exists, not what that something definitively is. Samples were collected from the luminol positive areas, but again, DNA analysis produced frustratingly ambiguous results. Years passed. The case officially closed in 2008, then reopened in 2011 with new investigators bringing fresh perspectives. And in 2019, a development emerged that would reignite forensic debate. Advanced DNA analysis techniques, impossible in 2007, were applied to samples that had been carefully stored from the original investigation. Touch DNA analysis, mitochondrial DNA sequencing, next-generation genetic profiling that could extract information from degraded samples that older methods could not process. The results of this reanalysis, completed between 2019 and 2022, revealed details that earlier testing had missed. Genetic markers appeared in the samples that did not match Madeleine McCann. They did not match Kate or Jerry McCann. They did not match the twin siblings. They did not match any of the Tapa's 7 friends who had been dining with the parents that night. They did not match any resort staff. They did not match any Portuguese investigators or British police who had worked the case. The markers represented an unknown contributor, a genetic ghost whose identity remained unidentified despite runs through international DNA databases. This discovery opened multiple interpretive pathways. Perhaps the unknown DNA came from previous occupants of the holiday apartment, biological material left behind by earlier tourists that standard cleaning had not removed. Vacation rentals cycle through hundreds of guests, each leaving microscopic traces of their presence. Perhaps the DNA was transfer evidence, carried in on shoes or clothing from the outside world. Perhaps it represented contamination during the evidence collection process itself, an investigator's inadvertent contribution despite protective protocols. Or perhaps it represented something more sinister, an unidentified individual who had been present in apartment 5A at a crucial time. Someone whose genetic signature was captured in the biological material collected from behind that sofa, from the luminal positive areas, from the spaces where the dogs had alerted. Architectural analysis of the apartment, conducted in subsequent years, added another layer of complexity to intruder theories. Experts examining the building's structure identified potential entry points that initial investigations had not fully considered. A side door leading from a stairwell could be accessed from an external area. Windows in neighboring apartments created sightline issues that meant certain approaches would be invisible to nearby witnesses. The layout of the Ocean Club resort itself, with its multiple access paths and limited security monitoring, made unauthorized entry far more plausible than early assessments suggested. The forensic examination of apartment 5A ultimately raised more questions than it answered. The cadaver dog alerts remain unexplained, accepted by some experts as credible indicators, dismissed by others as unreliable in the absence of corroborating evidence. The DNA samples continue to fuel speculation, their ambiguous nature allowing multiple interpretations to coexist. The cleaned area behind the sofa, the luminol reactions, the unknown genetic markers, all pieces of a puzzle that refuses to form a coherent picture. What really happened in that space remains one of the most haunting forensic mysteries in modern criminal investigation. Every piece of evidence can be viewed through competing lenses. Every finding supports multiple narratives. The apartment itself, now occupied by different vacationers unaware of its history, holds whatever secrets remain locked in surfaces and spaces that forensic science, despite all its advances, cannot definitively decode. The photograph shows a man with thinning hair and wire-rimmed glasses, standing awkwardly among Portuguese police officers in the bright Algarve sunshine. Robert Morat, a British-Portuguese property developer and translator, became the first suspect in a case that would consume 16 years of international investigation. He lived just 150 yards from apartment 5A at the Ocean Club Resort, close enough to see the activity on the night Madeleine McCann vanished, close enough to raise immediate questions about his presence. Morat had inserted himself into the investigation from the very beginning. On the morning of May 4, 2007, while other residents maintained a cautious distance from the police activity, Morat arrived at the scene offering his services as a translator. He spoke fluent Portuguese and English, and the police accepted his assistance. But something about his eagerness struck witnesses as unusual. Several British tourists later reported feeling uncomfortable with his questions, the way he lingered at the edges of conversations, how his eyes followed the movements of investigators with what they described as inappropriate interest. Journalists noticed him too. A reporter from the Mirror recognized Morat's persistent presence and mentioned him to Portuguese authorities. Within days, police had searched his home, Casa Liliana, the white villa where he lived with his mother just down the road from the Ocean Club. They brought in ground-penetrating radar equipment. They dug up parts of the garden. They removed computers, mobile phones, and questioned Morat for 17 hours. He maintained his innocence throughout, claiming he had been home with his mother the entire night of May 3rd. His mother corroborated this alibi, as did several phone records that appeared to place him at the property. The Portuguese police declared him an arguido, a formal suspect, yet they could never build a case that held together. No physical evidence linked him to Madeleine's disappearance. No witnesses could definitively place him near apartment 5A at the crucial time. The investigation into Morat eventually collapsed under its own weight of circumstantial suspicion, and in 2008, Portuguese authorities cleared him of involvement. He later won substantial libel damages from British newspapers that had named him as a suspect. But for many observers, questions lingered. Why had he involved himself so quickly? What explained the inconsistencies witnesses claimed to notice in his statements? As the Murat investigation faltered, the case transformed into something stranger, a cascade of reported sightings that sent investigators racing across 3 continents. A Belgian tourist claimed to have seen a young British girl in the Moroccan town of Zinat, spotted in the company of a woman whose description matched no known associate of the McCanns. This sighting, coming just weeks after the disappearance, generated enormous attention. Portuguese and Moroccan authorities coordinated searches. British detectives flew to North Africa to interview witnesses. But when investigators tracked down the girl in question, she turned out to be a local Moroccan child who simply resembled the missing girl. In 2008, a British couple on holiday in the Spanish island of Majorca reported seeing a blonde child who looked remarkably like Madeleine being led by a German man through a restaurant. The detail that caught their attention was the girl's apparent distress, the way she seemed to recoil from the man's grip. Spanish police investigated the lead for months, circulating descriptions, reviewing security footage from nearby establishments. The trail evaporated when no corresponding individuals could be located in the areas where the sighting occurred. Australia produced its own mysterious lead when a young girl matching Madeleine's description was reportedly photographed in the background of a tourist's snapshot taken near Melbourne. The image sparked frantic analysis. Could it be her? The age appeared right, the coloring seemed similar, and most compelling was the distinctive mark in the girl's right eye. The same rare coloboma that made Madeleine's gaze so distinctive. Australian Federal Police launched an investigation that spanned several states. They tracked down every blonde child in the region where the photograph was taken. Ultimately, they identified the girl in the image as a local Australian child, with no connection to the case. But the hours spent, the resources deployed, the hope that surged and died, this became the pattern that would define the investigation for years. What the public did not see during these years was the quieter, more methodical work happening beneath the surface of sensational headlines. Operation Grange, the British investigation launched in 2011, assembled a team that would eventually examine more than 40,000 documents and investigate over 600 persons of interest. Among these were individuals whose names never reached the newspapers, suspects identified through painstaking review of seemingly insignificant detail. Investigators became particularly interested in a series of photographs taken by British tourists in the days before Madeleine's disappearance. These images, reviewed during the Operation Grange assessment, showed several men in the vicinity of the Ocean Club who appeared in multiple photographs despite having no apparent connection to the resort. One man appeared in the background of vacation photos on 3 separate occasions, always alone, always watching. Enhanced analysis of these images revealed he had been taking his own photographs, not of the scenery or the beach, but of the apartment blocks where families stayed. Another man was captured on camera, sitting in a parked van near the children's play area on the afternoon of May 2nd, the day before Madeleine vanished. His face was partially obscured, and attempts to identify him through facial recognition technology produced no matches in European databases. These men were never conclusively identified. They became ghost suspects, shadows in the background of family holiday photos, their intentions unknowable, their identities lost despite sophisticated investigative techniques. But their presence suggested something investigators had begun to suspect, that whoever took Madeleine may have been conducting surveillance, studying the routines of families, identifying vulnerabilities in the resort security. The burglary connection opened another troubling avenue of investigation. The Algarve region in 2007 was experiencing a wave of break-ins targeting holiday properties. These were not random smash-and-grab operations. The burglars appeared to study properties carefully, often entering through patio doors or windows while occupants slept. They moved quietly enough to steal valuables from bedrooms without waking anyone. Portuguese police had identified a network of several men responsible for dozens of these crimes in the months surrounding Madeleine's disappearance. Operation Grange investigators discovered that 4 such burglaries had occurred in the Ocean Club complex in the 17 days before May 3rd. One of these break-ins happened in the same block as apartment 5A, just 3 doors away, less than a week before the McCanns arrived. The pattern intrigued investigators. Could Madeleine's disappearance have begun as a burglary gone wrong? Had someone entered the apartment seeking valuables and panicked when they found a child? 2 of the burglars identified by Portuguese police had been operating precisely in that area during the crucial time frame. Yet, when British detectives attempted to interview them years later, one had died and the other had disappeared, reportedly to South America. For 13 years, the investigation churned through these leads and hundreds of others. Then in June of 2020, German authorities announced a development that changed everything. They had identified a new suspect, a convicted sex offender named Christian Brueckner, and they believed he had killed Madeleine McCann. The statement from German prosecutor Hans Christian Wolters carried a certainty previous announcements had lacked. "We are investigating on suspicion of murder. We are assuming that the girl is dead. We have a suspect." Christian Brueckner was 43 years old when authorities named him. His history revealed a disturbing pattern of crimes. He had multiple convictions for sexual offenses against children. He had served prison time in Germany for abusing a young girl. Court records showed he had been drifting across Europe for years, supporting himself through petty crime, burglary, and drug dealing. In 2007, he was living in Portugal, specifically in the Algarve region, specifically near Praia da Luz. His home was a converted yellow and white Volkswagen camper van parked on a remote property just outside town, close enough to the Ocean Club that he could walk there in 20 minutes. The evidence connecting Brueckner to the case began with mobile phone records. On the night of May 3, 2007, at approximately 8:30 in the evening, Brueckner's Portuguese mobile phone received a call that lasted approximately 30 minutes. The call came from another mobile phone. The identity of the caller has never been publicly revealed. Cell tower analysis placed Brueckner's phone in the vicinity of the Ocean Club resort when this call occurred, less than 1 hour before Madeleine was reported missing. After the call ended, Brueckner's phone showed movement away from Praia da Luz toward the surrounding countryside. German investigators obtained these phone records years after the disappearance, during an investigation into Brueckner for unrelated crimes. When they cross-referenced his location history with the timeline of Madeleine's disappearance, the correlation was immediate and striking. But phone records alone do not prove presence, let alone involvement. What elevated Brueckner to the primary suspect was the accumulation of witness statements and physical evidence that investigators began piecing together. Several witnesses came forward after Brueckner was named, individuals who claimed they had seen him in Praia da Luz around the time of the disappearance, but had not understood the significance of their observations until his photograph appeared in news reports. One former acquaintance told investigators that Brueckner had spoken about the Ocean Club in the days before May 3rd, mentioning that rich tourists stayed there, that security was minimal, that there were opportunities for someone willing to take risks. Another witness, a German national who had known Brueckner in Portugal, described a conversation that allegedly occurred in a bar in 2017, the 10-year anniversary of Madeleine's disappearance. According to this witness, Brueckner had been drinking when someone mentioned the case. He allegedly said something that made others uncomfortable, a comment suggesting he knew what had happened to the missing girl. The most disturbing evidence came from items found during searches of properties associated with Brueckner. German police raided a factory building he had used as storage and a remote allotment garden plot he had rented. They removed thousands of items, including computers, USB drives, cameras, and photographs. Authorities have disclosed very little about what these searches revealed. They have confirmed finding child sexual abuse material. They have acknowledged discovering items potentially relevant to the McCann investigation. But the specific nature of this evidence remains sealed, protected by German legal procedures that prohibit detailed disclosure before charges are formally filed. Investigators also found evidence of Brueckner's movements in the days immediately following Madeleine's disappearance. Vehicle registration records show he re-registered his Jaguar car to someone else on May 4, 2007, the day after Madeleine vanished. Phone records indicate he left Portugal shortly thereafter, returning to Germany. This sudden departure, investigators suggest, may indicate consciousness of guilt, an attempt to distance himself from the area before suspicion could focus in his direction. Yet, despite the accumulation of circumstantial evidence, despite the confident statements from German prosecutors, no charges have been filed as of the present moment. Christian Brueckner remains in prison in Germany, serving a sentence for drug trafficking and the rape of a 72-year-old American woman in Portugal, a crime committed in 2005 in the same Praia da Luz area. He has denied any involvement in Madeleine McCann's disappearance through his lawyers. He has not been formally charged. The investigation continues, suspended in that strange space between suspicion and proof, between believing and knowing, between the evidence that investigators hold and the evidence they need to bring a case that could withstand the scrutiny of a courtroom and the passage of 16 years. The hunt for Madeleine McCann had languished in the shadows of traditional detective work for nearly a decade, when the digital age finally caught up with one of the world's most haunting mysteries. What investigators had painstakingly gathered through conventional means, door-to-door interviews, and witness statements and physical evidence collected from apartment 5A in the Ocean Club complex, represented merely the surface of what had actually happened that night in May of 2007. Beneath the visible world lay another realm entirely, one composed of data streams and digital footprints, of metadata and encrypted communications, of pixels and algorithms that had been quietly recording human behavior in ways previously unimaginable. And it would be this hidden digital landscape that would ultimately shatter the long-held assumption that Madeleine's disappearance had been the work of a lone opportunist who had simply vanished into the Portuguese night. The transformation began in earnest during 2017, when a specialized unit within the Metropolitan Police, working in conjunction with technology firms and digital forensics experts, initiated what would become the most comprehensive technological investigation ever applied to a cold case. These weren't your traditional detectives hunched over filing cabinets and faded photographs. These were specialists who spoke in terms of packet sniffers and blockchain analysis, who understood that the internet never truly forgets, and who possessed the tools to excavate data that perpetrators believed had been buried beyond recovery. Their mission was to apply every advancement in digital forensics developed over the preceding decade to the evidence gathered from Praia da Luz, and to search for patterns and connections that human investigators, limited by the technology of their time, could never have detected. The dark web became an immediate focus, that encrypted, hidden portion of the internet where anonymity reigns and where the darkest aspects of human nature find expression. Monitoring teams established sophisticated tracking systems, deploying artificial intelligence to scan thousands of hidden forums and encrypted chat rooms, searching for any reference to Praia da Luz, to the Ocean Club, to blonde British children, to Portugal in the spring of 2007. What they discovered sent a chill through even the most seasoned investigators. In the weeks immediately surrounding Madeleine's disappearance, there had been a marked increase in chatter on certain forums. Discussions that used coded language, but that referenced the Algarve region, that mentioned timelines correlating precisely with the abduction, that suggested prior knowledge of the layout of the Ocean Club complex. These weren't casual conversations. The language patterns suggested planning, coordination, a level of organization that spoke to something far more sinister than a spontaneous crime of opportunity. But it was the encrypted communications that proved most disturbing. Using advanced decryption techniques and exploiting security vulnerabilities in older encryption protocols, forensic analysts began piecing together fragments of conversations between a network of individuals, communications that had been routed through multiple servers across different continents, designed specifically to avoid detection. The messages were careful, often oblique, but the references were unmistakable to those who knew what they were looking for. Discussions of the Ocean Club, mentions of British families, coded language about acquisition and transport, time stamps that placed these conversations in the days and hours before Madeleine vanished. And most chilling of all, celebratory exchanges in the immediate aftermath, communications between parties who appeared to be congratulating each other on a successful operation. The implication was staggering. This wasn't the random act of a drifter or the impulsive crime of a disturbed individual. The digital evidence suggested something organized, a network of people who had planned, executed, and then concealed their involvement with disturbing efficiency. The investigation now faced a terrifying possibility that multiple parties had worked in coordination, that the abduction had been orchestrated, and that the reason conventional detective work had failed to crack the case was because they had been searching for a single perpetrator when they should have been hunting an organization. Meanwhile, another team of specialists was conducting an entirely different kind of digital archaeology. In 2007, smartphones were just emerging into mainstream use. The first iPhone had been released mere weeks before Madeleine's disappearance. Digital cameras were ubiquitous among tourists, and the Algarve, being a prime vacation destination, had been saturated with visitors capturing their holidays in thousands of photographs. Each of these images contained something invisible to the naked eye, but invaluable to modern investigators: metadata. Every digital photograph embeds information about when it was taken, what camera settings were used, and crucially, if the device had location services enabled, exactly where the photographer was standing when they pressed the shutter. Forensic teams issued appeals across Europe, requesting that anyone who had visited Praia da Luz in late April or early May of 2007 submit their holiday photographs, even if they believed they had captured nothing relevant. The response was overwhelming. Tens of thousands of images flooded into the investigation. Everything from snapshots of sunsets over the Atlantic to pictures of children building sandcastles. Advanced image processing software began the painstaking work of analyzing each photograph, extracting the metadata, building a comprehensive timeline of tourist activity in the area, and most importantly, identifying individuals who appeared in multiple photographs taken by different people. The geolocation data proved revelatory. By mapping the precise locations where photographs had been taken, investigators could reconstruct patterns of movement throughout the Ocean Club complex and the surrounding area with unprecedented accuracy. They identified individuals who had been photographed repeatedly in locations that suggested surveillance rather than tourism. There were men who appeared in background shots near apartment 5A on multiple occasions in the days before the disappearance. Individuals who had no apparent reason to be loitering in those specific areas, who were never sunbathing or swimming or engaged in typical vacation activities, but who seemed to be observing, waiting, positioning themselves. Cross-referencing these images with facial recognition databases revealed identities that opened entirely new avenues of investigation. Several of the individuals identified through this photographic analysis had criminal records, histories involving child exploitation, connections to trafficking networks. Some had traveled to Portugal using false documents. Others had fled the country within hours of Madeleine's disappearance, abandoning rental cars and leaving hotel bills unpaid in their haste to evacuate the area. The digital trail they left behind, flight bookings and credit card transactions and border crossing records, painted a picture of coordinated retreat, of multiple parties simultaneously removing themselves from Portugal as law enforcement descended on Praia da Luz. The investigation also deployed cutting-edge facial recognition technology in the search for Madeleine herself. Age progression specialists, working with artificial intelligence systems trained on millions of faces, created detailed projections of how Madeleine would appear at various ages, from the immediate years after her disappearance through to her current age in 2023. These AI-enhanced images weren't the crude, manual sketches of previous decades. They incorporated sophisticated understanding of how facial structures change with age, how genetic traits express themselves over time, how bone structure and soft tissue evolve through childhood and into adolescence. These age-progressed images were then fed into facial recognition systems that scanned through millions of photographs from across the globe, social media platforms and school databases and passport records, searching for potential matches. The system generated thousands of possible candidates, each requiring individual investigation to rule out or pursue. Some leads proved heartbreaking. Families contacted only to confirm that their daughter, who bore a striking resemblance to the aged images of Madeleine, had been born well after 27, or had a completely documented life history that eliminated any possibility of connection. But other leads remained tantalizing, unresolved. Faces that appeared in photographs from distant countries. Children whose origins seemed deliberately obscured. Cases where the trail went cold precisely when investigators needed it most. Perhaps the most unsettling discoveries emerged from analyzing what wasn't there anymore: the digital ghosts of deleted accounts and scrubbed websites. Forensic teams identified social media accounts that had been active in 2007 and early 2008, accounts belonging to individuals who had been in or near Praia da Luz during the relevant time frame, accounts that had been systematically deleted within months of the abduction. While the accounts themselves were gone, fragments remained, cached pages stored on servers, screenshots preserved by web archiving services, metadata that revealed patterns of communication between account holders. These deleted accounts formed a network, individuals who had communicated with each other before, during, and briefly after Madeleine's disappearance, and then had simultaneously scrubbed their digital presence. Some had posted photographs, geotagged to Praia da Luz. Others had checked into locations near the Ocean Club, using early social media features. Several had exchanged messages with each other in the days immediately following May 3, 2007, messages whose content was lost, but whose timing suggested urgent communication, coordination, perhaps damage control. Websites, too, had been scrubbed, domains registered in early 2007 that had been taken down precipitously within weeks of the abduction. Forensic analysis of archived versions of these sites revealed disturbing content: forums discussing topics that suggested interest in child exploitation, marketplace-style listings that used coded language now recognized as trafficking indicators. Several of these sites had been accessed from IP addresses in the Algarve region during the precise time frame of Madeleine's disappearance. Server logs, painstakingly reconstructed, showed coordinated activity, multiple users accessing the same hidden pages within minutes of each other, suggesting real-time communication and coordination. The encrypted messages presented the greatest challenge and the most damning evidence. Modern cryptography, when properly implemented, remains largely unbreakable, even with significant computational resources. But the encryption methods used in 2007 were primitive by current standards, and investigators possessed both time and advanced quantum computing capabilities unavailable to the original perpetrators. Slowly, painfully, fragments of conversations emerged from the digital noise. Individual messages remained largely indecipherable, but patterns became clear. Burst communications between parties in the days before May 3rd. A flurry of activity on the night of the disappearance itself, messages flying between multiple parties across different time zones. Then silence, a deliberate cessation of communication on those particular encrypted channels, as if the parties involved had recognized their vulnerability and had moved to even more secure methods of contact. What terrified investigators most was the implication of these patterns. This wasn't the digital footprint of panicked criminals reacting to an unplanned crime. This was the signature of organized individuals executing a predetermined plan, coordinating their actions, and then methodically covering their track. The network appeared sophisticated, disciplined, and most disturbingly, potentially still active. If this group had successfully orchestrated Madeleine's abduction, had they done so before? Had they done so since? Were there other families, other children, other Praia da Luz scenarios that simply hadn't captured global attention? The technological revolution in the Madeleine McCann investigation hasn't solved the case, not yet, but it has fundamentally transformed it. What was once viewed as a tragic but isolated incident, the terrible luck of a family whose daughter attracted the attention of a lone predator, now appears to be something far more organized and sinister. The digital evidence points not to a monster working alone, but to a network of individuals, coordinated and deliberate, who may have specifically targeted Praia da Luz and the Ocean Club, who may have selected Madeleine McCann according to criteria we can only imagine, and who possessed the sophistication to nearly succeed in vanishing without a trace. Nearly, but not completely, because the internet, for all its illusions of anonymity and impermanence, remembers everything. And somewhere in those vast stores of data, in metadata and deleted files and encrypted communications, lies the truth of what happened on that spring night in Portugal, waiting for the right algorithm, the right analyst, the right breakthrough to finally bring it to light. In the world of high-profile missing persons cases, false confessions arrive with disturbing regularity. But some confessions, some whispered deathbed admissions, Some coded conversations intercepted by investigators contain details that cannot be easily explained away. The Madeleine McCann case has accumulated a dark collection of these moments over the years, each one offering a tantalizing glimpse of potential truth before dissolving into frustration and dead end. These near breaks in the investigation reveal something profound about human psychology, about our relationship with tragedy, and about the terrifying possibility that someone out there knows exactly what happened and watches, perhaps with satisfaction, as the world continues to search. The confessions began almost immediately after Madeleine disappeared in 2007. Within weeks of the news spreading globally, police forces across Europe were fielding claims from individuals who insisted they were responsible. Some were obviously mentally unwell, reciting details pulled directly from news reports. Others were attention seekers, drawn to the spotlight that surrounds any major case. But a few confessions contained elements that made investigators pause, details that hadn't been publicly released, descriptions that seemed too specific to dismiss entirely. The psychology of false confession in cases like this, one reveals uncomfortable truths about human nature. Forensic psychologists identify several types of individuals drawn to falsely confess to notorious crime. Some suffer from guilt complexes so severe that they genuinely come to believe they committed acts they never performed. Others experience what experts call magical thinking, a psychological state where the boundary between fantasy and reality becomes dangerously permeable. Then there are those driven by a darker impulse, the desire to become part of something significant, to matter in a world where they feel invisible. For these individuals, even infamy represents a form of validation. One man in 28 walked into a police station in Barcelona, claiming he had taken Madeleine and could lead authorities to her body. He provided a detailed account of the abduction, describing the layout of apartment 5A in ways that seemed accurate. Under interrogation, however, investigators realized he was describing details visible in crime scene photographs that had leaked to the press. When they asked him about elements not publicly known, specifically the position of certain furniture and the contents of drawers in the children's bedroom, his story fell apart. He later admitted he had been homeless and wanted to be imprisoned somewhere with regular meals and shelter. But the 8 days spent investigating his claims diverted resources from genuine leads. Another confession came from a British man in 2010 who contacted authorities claiming his deceased friend had confessed involvement to him years earlier. This man provided names, dates, and a convoluted story involving a trafficking ring. Investigators spent months tracking down every element of his account. They traveled to 3 countries, interviewed dozens of witnesses, and sifted through financial records. Eventually, they discovered the entire narrative was fabricated, apparently motivated by a desire to settle personal scores with individuals he'd named as accomplices. The man faced prosecution for wasting police time, but the damage was done. Hundreds of investigative hours had been consumed by his lies. Then there are the confessions that don't fall into neat categories, the ones that keep investigators awake at night. In 2021, a nurse working in a hospital in Portugal contacted the Portuguese Polícia Área with information that sent shockwaves through the investigation. She reported that a patient in his late 60s, dying from advanced liver disease, had made statements about the British girl during a period of semi-consciousness. According to the nurse, the man had been agitated, muttering in Portuguese and broken English about a child, a white apartment, and something he described as the hiding place where they never looked. What made this case extraordinary was the specificity of certain details the dying man allegedly provided. The nurse, who had followed the McCann case over the years like many Portuguese citizens, recognized that some of what the patient was saying didn't match publicly available information. She wrote down what she could remember and reported it through official channels. When investigators cross-referenced her notes with sealed case files, they discovered multiple points of alignment, with evidence never released to the public. These details related to specific items in the apartment, the timeline of events on the night of May 3, 2007, and physical evidence collected at the scene. The case seemed to finally represent a genuine breakthrough. Investigators rushed to the hospital, but the patient had died 2 days after making his statements. His identity raised more questions than it answered. He had no criminal record in Portugal or internationally. His name had never appeared in connection with the investigation. He had been living quietly in Porto for decades, working as a carpenter until his retirement. There was no obvious connection to Praia da Luz, no evidence placing him in the Algarve in May of 2007. Authorities attempted to reconstruct his movements during the relevant period. They discovered he had made a trip to the Algarve region in the spring of 2007, ostensibly to work on a renovation project. The timeline was right, but the trail went cold. The construction company he'd allegedly worked for had gone out of business in 2012. Fellow workers from that period were difficult to trace. Some had returned to Eastern Europe. Others had died or moved on to untraceable locations. The lead, so promising at first, gradually dissolved into the same frustrating ambiguity that has characterized so many aspects of this case. What investigators found most disturbing was that the dying man's family had no knowledge of any connection to the case. His widow insisted her husband had never mentioned anything about Madeleine McCann, had never displayed unusual guilt or anxiety about that period of his life. Either he had kept a devastating secret for 14 years, or the deathbed statements were the confused ramblings of a dying brain, details picked up from news coverage over the years and regurgitated in semi-conscious delirium. The case remains officially open but unresolved, another tantalizing near miss in an investigation filled with them. The most significant development in recent years involves Christian Brueckner, the German national, identified as a formal suspect in 2020. Brueckner's history is deeply disturbing. He has convictions for child sexual abuse and was living in Praia da Luz in 2007. His vehicle was captured on CCTV in the area around the Ocean Club on the day Madeleine disappeared. German prosecutors announced in June of 2020 that they believed Madeleine was dead and that they had evidence linking Brueckner to her disappearance. Among the most chilling elements of the evidence against Brueckner are recorded conversations he had with associates while in prison on unrelated charges. German prosecutors claim these recordings contain veiled references to Madeleine, though the coded language makes definitive interpretation difficult. In one conversation reportedly recorded in 2017, Brueckner allegedly discusses a job in Portugal that went differently than planned. The transcript, portions of which have been described by German media, includes references to tourist season, small packages, and the apartment job. Linguists and investigators have analyzed these recordings for hidden meaning. The coded language appears consistent with someone attempting to discuss criminal activity without explicit admission. Brueckner reportedly uses phrases like the thing that got everyone's attention and what happened at the beach place. In one particularly disturbing exchange, he allegedly tells an associate that he knows how to make things disappear and that he's done it where everyone was looking, but nobody saw. 1. The problem investigators face is that coded language, by its nature, resists definitive interpretation. Defense attorneys argue these phrases could refer to any number of criminal activities Brueckner was involved in, from drug trafficking to burglaries. Without explicit mention of Madeleine by name, the recordings provide circumstantial evidence at best. German prosecutors remain confident they have sufficient evidence to eventually charge Brueckner, but years have passed since the initial announcement without formal charges being filed. Perhaps the most unsettling dimension of this case is the evidence suggesting someone involved has been following the investigation obsessively online. Digital forensic investigators have identified patterns of activity on true crime forums and discussion boards that raise disturbing possibilities. Certain users have posted information about the case that later proved accurate, despite not being publicly available at the time of posting. These posts were typically buried in long threads, written in ways that seemed speculative but contained kernels of truth. One user, posting across multiple forums between 2012 and 2019, made several statements about the case that seemed like theories or guesses, but aligned precisely with sealed evidence. This user discussed specific details about the timeline, about physical evidence found at the scene, about investigative leads that had never been publicly disclosed. When investigators attempted to trace this user, they found the posts had been made using sophisticated anonymization techniques, routing through multiple proxy servers across different countries. The psychological profile of someone who would do this fits a particular pattern. Certain types of offenders derive satisfaction not just from the crime itself, but from the power of possessing exclusive knowledge while watching others search for answers. This behavior represents a form of continued control, a way of extending the gratification derived from the original act by inserting themselves into online discussions, by dropping hints and watching the community react. Such individuals feed a need for significance and power. Some posts from suspicious accounts contain what appear to be deliberate taunts disguised as speculation, references to what really happened in the apartment, descriptions of what nobody knows about that night, and statements like the truth is simpler than everyone thinks, but in a different direction than they're looking. These posts create a horrifying scenario where the person responsible for Madeleine's disappearance might be watching the global search effort, reading every theory, observing the family's continued anguish, and deriving some dark satisfaction from their unique position of knowledge. Investigators have consulted with behavioral analysts who specialize in online predator behavior. The consensus is that it would be entirely consistent with certain psychological profiles for the perpetrator to engage with online communities discussing the case. The anonymity of the internet provides a safe space for such engagement, allowing the individual to experience the thrill of proximity to the investigation without the risk of exposure. For someone driven by narcissism or a need for control, the temptation to demonstrate superior knowledge, even in veiled ways, can prove irresistible. The possibility that someone out there possesses complete knowledge of what happened, that they might read news coverage and watch documentaries and follow social media discussions, represents perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this entire case. It transforms the investigation from a search for truth into a psychological game where the perpetrator holds all the cards and chooses whether to ever reveal them. Every forum post, every online comment, every anonymous tip could potentially be a message from the one person who knows exactly where Madeleine is and what happened to her. And in that terrifying possibility lies the ultimate violation, the perpetrator not just committing a crime, but continuing to control the narrative, watching the world search while they alone possess the answers everyone desperately seeks. The truth that investigators have uncovered is far more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. What began as a single missing child case in Praia da Luz has evolved into something that reaches across borders, connecting dots that reveal a pattern so methodical, so organized, that it challenges everything we thought we understood about Madeleine McCann's disappearance. Operation Grange, the massive British investigation that began in 2011, uncovered something in their files that sent shockwaves through the entire investigative team. Just weeks before Madeleine vanished, in the bustling streets of Barcelona, another incident occurred that would only make sense years later when examined alongside the McCann case. A woman approached a family at a public venue, showing unusual interest in their young daughter. The child bore a resemblance to Victoria Beckham's daughter, Harper, and the woman's behavior was so alarming that the family reported it to authorities. The incident itself might have been dismissed as isolated, but the methodology, the approach, the targeting, all bore striking similarities to reports that would later emerge from Praia da Luz. What makes this connection particularly chilling is not just the proximity in time, but the precision of the approach. In both cases, witnesses described individuals who seemed to have studied their targets, who knew exactly when and where to make contact, who displayed a level of planning that suggested experience, practice, refinement. This was not opportunistic. This was calculated. The Barcelona incident became known internally among investigators as the Victoria Beckham case, and it opened a door into an investigation that would span continents. When detectives began examining similar incidents along the Portuguese coast between 2005 and 2009, they discovered something that fundamentally changed the direction of their inquiry. The pattern was undeniable. In 2005, a British child was nearly abducted from her bed in a holiday apartment in the Algarve region. The methodology was eerily familiar. The parents were dining nearby. The door was accessed without force. The child was specifically targeted. The attempt failed only because the child woke and screamed, scaring off the intruder. The case was filed, investigated locally, and eventually went cold. In 2006, another incident. A family staying in Carbuero, just 20 miles from Praia da Luz, reported an attempted break-in at their ground floor apartment where their young daughter slept. The timing matched. late evening, parents away from the room, a methodical approach to entry. Again, the attempt was unsuccessful, but again, the pattern held. These were not random burglaries. The targets were specific: young female children, British families, holiday accommodations. The intruders showed no interest in valuables easily accessible. They came for something else entirely. Then came Madeleine's disappearance in May of 2007, and suddenly, the pattern had a name, a face, a case that would capture global attention. But the incidents did not stop there. In 2009, another British family in the Algarve region reported a man entering their holiday apartment at night. Their 5-year-old daughter woke to find a stranger standing over her bed. The man fled when the child cried out, leaving behind no forensic evidence, no clear trail, but adding another data point to a pattern that was becoming impossible to ignore. When Operation Grange began compiling these cases, analyzing the methodologies, mapping the locations and timelines, they discovered something even more disturbing. These incidents were not confined to Portugal. Similar patterns emerged in Spain, in France, along the Mediterranean coast, in popular tourist destinations where British families vacation. The scope was international. The coordination was evident. Witness testimony began painting an even darker picture. Multiple families who had stayed in the Algarve region during this period came forward with reports that had seemed inconsequential at the time, but now carried sinister implications. Parents described encounters with individuals who showed unusual interest in their children. Not the casual attention that young children sometimes receive, but something more focused, more deliberate. One British mother reported a man who photographed children at a resort pool in 2006. Not families, not groups, but specifically young girls, alone or playing together. When she confronted him, he claimed to be a professional photographer working on a travel brochure. She reported the incident to resort management, who asked him to leave, but no formal complaint was filed with police. The man's identity was never determined. Another family described a couple at a restaurant in Praia da Luz, weeks before Madeleine disappeared, who asked detailed questions about their vacation schedule, where they were staying, how long they would be there, whether their children slept soundly. The questions seemed friendly at the time, typical vacation small talk. In retrospect, they felt like reconnaissance. These accounts, dozens of them, began forming a mosaic that revealed something investigators had long suspected but struggled to prove. This was not the work of a single predator. This was organized. This was networked. This was coordinated across borders with a level of sophistication that suggested funding, communication systems, and most chilling of all, a market. Operation Grange investigators working with Interpol and Europol uncovered communications between known offenders across multiple countries. Encrypted messages, code words, references that, when decoded, revealed discussions about targets, locations, methodologies. The investigation revealed connections between individuals in Portugal, Spain, Germany, Belgium, and the United Kingdom. These were not isolated criminals operating independently. They were communicating, sharing information, potentially coordinating their activities. One particular communication thread that emerged during the investigation discussed resort locations along the Portuguese coast. The messages referenced timings, security measures, accessibility of ground floor apartments, patterns of tourist behavior. The language was clinical, detached, operational. These were not the ramblings of disturbed individuals acting on impulse. These were planning documents, strategy sessions, operational briefings. The discovery of these communications led investigators to examine whether Madeleine's case intersected with this larger network. The evidence, while circumstantial, is deeply troubling. The methodology used in Praia da Luz matches methodologies discussed in these communications. The timing aligns with known periods of activity. The location was specifically mentioned in recovered documents as a target area due to its high concentration of British tourists and lax security measures at many holiday accommodations. Perhaps most disturbing is what investigators discovered about the organizational structure of these networks. This was not a loose affiliation of like-minded criminals. This was hierarchical, with clear roles and responsibilities. There were scouts who identified targets and gathered intelligence. There were operators who executed abductions. There were facilitators who provided logistics, safe houses, transportation, and there were clients, individuals who funded these operations for purposes that investigators struggle to articulate without descending into descriptions too dark for most people to comprehend. The scale of what Operation Grange uncovered is staggering. Investigators now believe that between 2005 and 2010, this network may have been responsible for dozens of attempted abductions across Europe, with several successful cases that remain unsolved to this day. The methodology was refined over time. Early attempts were crude, easily thwarted. Later operations showed sophistication born of experience and learning from previous failures. Madeleine's case fits into this timeline at a critical point. By 2007, the network had refined its approach. They understood how to identify vulnerable targets. They knew which accommodations offered the easiest access. They had studied the behavior patterns of British families on holiday, the tendency to dine out while children slept, the trust placed in resort security, the reluctance to lock windows and doors in warm weather. The Ocean Club in Praia da Luz was, from an operational perspective, an ideal target. Ground floor apartments with easily accessible windows, a layout that allowed for quick entry and exit, a distance between dining areas and accommodations that provided operational time, a transient population of tourists who were unfamiliar with the area and each other, making surveillance and planning less likely to be noticed. Investigators examining the timeline of that evening now believe that what happened to Madeleine was not opportunistic. The apartment was likely under surveillance for days before May 3rd. The family's routine was observed and documented. The window of opportunity, that period when the parents were at the tapas restaurant, was anticipated and exploited with precision. But the most chilling aspect of this theory is what it suggests about what happened after Madeleine was taken. If this was indeed the work of an organized network, then the immediate aftermath would have been carefully planned. There would have been a predetermined extraction route. A safe house, likely within an hour's drive, where Madeleine could be held while the initial search focused on Praia da Luz. Transportation arranged, possibly by sea, to move her quickly out of Portugal before borders could be effectively monitored. The network's communication patterns suggested they understood the critical window, those first 24 to 48 hours, when searches are most intensive, but also most chaotic. Get beyond that window, get beyond the immediate geographic area, and the chances of recovery drop precipitously. This is exactly what happened in Madeleine's case. By the time the alert reached a level that triggered border monitoring, more than 12 hours had passed. More than enough time for a well-organized operation to have moved a child hundreds of miles from the abduction site. Operation Grange's investigation into these networks revealed something else that haunts investigators to this day. Several of the individuals identified as part of this network had prior convictions or suspicions related to child exploitation. They were known to authorities in their respective countries. They were on watch lists, monitored to varying degrees. Yet they were able to travel freely across European borders, communicate across jurisdictions, and operate with a level of impunity that speaks to failures in international law enforcement coordination. One individual of particular interest to investigators was in Praia da Luz the night Madeleine disappeared. This person had known connections to organized exploitation networks, had been questioned in relation to other cases in Germany and Belgium, and was placed in the area through cell phone records and witness testimony. Yet this information did not emerge until years after the fact, buried in different national databases that were never cross-referenced, overlooked in the chaos of the initial investigation. The international investigation also uncovered financial transactions that suggest a commercial element to these operations. Money moving between accounts in different countries, patterns of payment that aligned with known abduction dates, transfers that suggested a market existed for these crimes. The amounts were substantial, indicating that whatever was happening, it was lucrative enough to sustain an organized network across multiple countries. This is the darkest truth that has emerged from over a decade of investigation. Madeleine McCann may not have been the victim of a random predator who happened to be in Praia da Luz that night. She may have been the victim of something far more sinister, an organized criminal network that targeted vulnerable children with precision, efficiency, and a level of planning that speaks to experience and practice. The implications of this theory are almost too horrific to process. It means that what happened was preventable. It means that patterns existed that should have been recognized. It means that children were being targeted, surveilled, and victimized by coordinated groups, while law enforcement agencies in multiple countries failed to connect the dots. It means that Madeleine's disappearance was not an isolated tragedy, but part of a larger pattern of exploitation that continues to this day. Investigators involved in Operation Grange have described the moment these connections became clear as one of the most disturbing revelations of their careers. To realize that they were not hunting a single predator, but potentially uncovering a web of coordinated criminals operating across borders, fundamentally changed the nature of the investigation. It expanded the scope beyond anything they had anticipated. It meant that finding Madeleine, if she was still alive, would require dismantling an entire network, not just identifying a single suspect. The conspiracy, if we can call it that, is not some elaborate fiction dreamed up by theorists seeking patterns in chaos. It is the conclusion reached by professional investigators analyzing thousands of data points, communications, financial records, and witness testimonies. It is the only explanation that accounts for the patterns they discovered, the sophistication of the methodologies, the international scope of similar crimes. This is what keeps investigators searching after all these years. The belief that Madeleine's case is connected to something larger, something that continues to operate, something that will only be stopped when these networks are exposed and dismantled. Every communication they decode, every connection they trace, every pattern they identify, brings them closer to understanding not just what happened to one little girl in Praia da Luz, but what has happened to dozens of children across Europe whose cases remain unsolved. The truth is more terrifying than any single theory about what happened that night. It suggests that Madeleine walked into a trap that had been carefully set, that her disappearance was the culmination of planning and coordination by individuals who had done this before and have likely done it since. It means that, somewhere in the world, people know exactly what happened to Madeleine McCann, and they have kept that secret for over a decade while continuing to operate in the shadows, targeting the vulnerable, exploiting the gaps in international law enforcement, and profiting from crimes too dark for most people to acknowledge exist. There are mysteries that fade with time, their edges softened by the years, until they become little more than footnotes in dusty case files. And then there are mysteries like Madeleine McCann, which seem to grow sharper and more complex with each passing year, each new lead, each promised breakthrough that somehow generates more questions than answers. 17 years have elapsed since that May night in Praia da Luz, and the world is no closer to knowing what truly happened to the 3-year-old girl who vanished from apartment 5A. The most fundamental question remains the most devastating in its simplicity. Despite searches spanning 3 continents, despite excavations in Portugal and Germany, despite underwater surveys and ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs and satellite imagery, no body has ever been found. Police have dug up gardens in the Algarve and basements in Braunschweig. They have drained reservoirs and searched abandoned wells. They have followed leads to Australia, to New Zealand, to Morocco, to Belgium. Hundreds of thousands of hours, millions of pounds, countless resources devoted to finding one small girl, and yet nothing. The absence itself has become a kind of presence, a void that generates its own terrible momentum. Does this mean hope, or does it mean something far worse? Does it mean Madeleine was taken far from where she disappeared, hidden in a place no one has thought to look? Or does it mean that whoever took her knew exactly how to ensure she would never be found? Then, there is the evidence that once existed, but exists no longer. Items collected from apartment 5A that somehow disappeared from Portuguese police custody. Reports that were filed and then could not be located. Photographs that were taken and then vanished from the case files. In 2008, it emerged that crucial forensic samples had degraded beyond usefulness due to improper storage. Other evidence was reportedly lost during the transfer between investigation teams. Some items were returned to the McCann family before all testing could be completed. Each missing piece represents not just a gap in the investigation, but a door permanently closed, a question that can never be answered because the means to answer it no longer exists. What truths might those lost fragments have revealed? What direction might the investigation have taken if every piece of evidence had been preserved, cataloged, Analyzed with the technology available today. The anonymous calls haunt the case like ghosts. Over the years, investigators have received hundreds of tips from people who claim to know something, who hint at dark knowledge, who promise to reveal the truth if certain conditions are met. Some callers have phoned multiple times, always from untraceable numbers, always offering just enough detail to seem credible, but never enough to be actionable. They speak of locations, of vehicles, of people seen that night, and then they disappear, never following through, never making contact again. Were these hoaxers seeking attention, or were they genuinely conflicted individuals who knew something but could not bring themselves to fully confess? One caller in 29 told investigators that Madeleine was buried near a specific type of tree common in the Algarve, but when pressed for exact coordinates, the line went dead and the number was never used again. Another claimed to have seen her being taken onto a boat at Lagos Marina, but refused to provide a description of the vessel or the people aboard. These phantom voices represent a special kind of torment for investigators and family alike. The suggestion of knowledge just out of reach, truth hovering at the edges of the case but never quite coming into focus. The night itself remains a puzzle of contradictions and gaps. The car seen speeding away from Praia da Luz at approximately 11 in the evening, witnessed by 3 separate people who gave remarkably similar descriptions. A light-colored sedan driving far too fast for the narrow streets, heading toward the highway. Police investigated but never identified the vehicle or its driver. Was it connected to Madeleine's disappearance? Or simply a coincidence? Someone late for an appointment? Someone rushing to the hospital? Someone drunk trying to get home? The specificity of the time has always troubled investigators, because if Madeleine was taken from the apartment closer to 10 that evening, as most timelines suggest, what was this car doing, and where had it been for that missing hour? Then there is the man seen by multiple witnesses carrying a child toward the beach, a figure who has generated countless sketches and reconstructions and theories, but has never been definitively identified. He was described by some as appearing purposeful, by others as seeming furtive. The child in his arms was either asleep or unconscious, either wearing pink pajamas or white ones, either blonde or light brown haired. The witnesses were certain and uncertain in equal measure, their memories shaped by darkness and distance and the terrible weight of what they might have seen. Despite extensive publicity, despite the images being shown across Europe and beyond, this man has never come forward, has never been found. If he was innocent, if he was simply a father carrying his own sleeping child home from a late dinner, surely he would have recognized himself in those sketches. Surely he would have contacted police to eliminate himself from inquiries. His continued anonymity suggests either that he is deliberately hiding, or that the witnesses saw something else entirely, their minds constructing a coherent image from fragments of shadow and movement and suggestion. Perhaps most frustrating are the witness statements that remain sealed by court order, locked away in Portuguese legal archives, inaccessible even to investigators working the case today. These testimonies, given in the days and weeks after Madeleine's disappearance, reportedly contain information deemed too sensitive for public release. But sensitive to whom? To the investigation itself? To the privacy of witnesses? Or to powerful individuals who might be implicated? The very existence of sealed statements feeds speculation and conspiracy, suggests hidden truths and protected secrets. What could be in those statements that require such protection 17 years later? What names might they contain? What allegations? What observations that someone has decided the world is not permitted to know? Each breakthrough in the case has followed the same maddening pattern. In 2013, new analysis of cellular data revealed previously unknown suspects in the area that night, but the leads went nowhere. In 2020, German authorities announced they had identified a suspect, a convicted criminal with a history of child abuse who had been living near Praia da Luz in May of 2007. It seemed like the answer, finally, after all these years. But 4 years later, Christian Brueckner has been charged with nothing related to Madeleine's disappearance, despite claims by prosecutors that they have evidence she is dead. What evidence? Evidence they cannot or will not reveal. Evidence that is somehow sufficient to declare her deceased, but insufficient to bring charges. The announcement brought a moment of terrible clarity to the McCann family, followed by a return to the same agonizing uncertainty that has defined their lives for nearly 2 decades. Every answer seems to conceal another question. Every door that opens reveals 3 more locked tight behind it. Why was Brueckner's name not flagged earlier when he was known to local police? Why did witnesses who saw his distinctive vehicle near the Ocean Club that week not come forward sooner? What exactly did the German cell phone data reveal, and why has it not been enough to build a prosecutable case? The new evidence, touted as definitive as case closing, has instead generated its own ecosystem of mysteries and doubts and unanswered queries. The mathematics of time creates its own heartbreak. Madeleine McCann would be 20 years old now. She would be finishing university or starting a career. She would have grown from a tiny 3-year-old with a distinctive mark in her right eye into a young woman with her own dreams and plans and future. If she is alive, if she was taken and raised by someone else, does she know? Has she looked in mirrors and wondered about that mark in her eye? Googled it perhaps? Found the images that have circulated for years? Or was she taken too young to remember anything of her life before? Her identity erased completely, her past replaced with a fabricated story. The thought that she might be out there, living an ordinary life, unaware that she's the subject of one of the most extensive missing person investigations in history, is somehow both hopeful and unbearably sad. But someone knows. This is the certainty that anchors the case despite all its uncertainties. Someone knows exactly what happened in apartment 5A, or shortly thereafter, on the night of May 3rd, 2007. Someone knows whether Madeleine McCann is alive or dead, whether she was taken by a stranger or someone closer to home, whether her disappearance was planned or opportunistic. That person has lived with this knowledge for 17 years, has watched the news coverage and the appeals and the investigations, has remained silent while a family has been torn apart by not knowing. How does someone carry such a secret? How do they sleep at night, go about their daily life, interact with others, all while holding the answer to a question that has haunted millions? The final question is the one that refuses to be silenced, the one that echoes through every documentary and podcast and news article, the one that Kate and Gary McCann must ask themselves in their darkest moments. Is Madeleine McCann still out there somewhere, unaware of who she really is, living a life that was built on lies and theft and the erasure of her true identity? Or did the truth die with her on that very first night, in those first hours after she was taken from her bed, before the searches even began, before the world knew her name? The question hangs in the air, unanswered and unanswerable, a mystery that may endure for decades more. A little girl who became a symbol of every parent's worst nightmare and every investigator's most frustrating failure. Someone knows. Somewhere, someone knows. And until they speak, Madeleine McCann remains suspended between hope and despair, between life and death, between the known and the unknowable, a 3-year-old girl who vanished into the night and never came home. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.